In 1969, 6 participants in a Soviet sensory rehabilitation program completed a standard navigation assessment in an unfamiliar room. 5 performed as expected, locating objects by sound, mapping the space by echo, demonstrating the functional competence the program had been designed to develop. The 6th performed as expected and then continued. He described objects in the room that had not been included in the assessment, objects the researchers themselves had not noticed. When they checked, the objects were there. The program was called Projekt Slepoi, Project Blind. It began as a rehabilitation initiative. It ended as something the medical archive does not have a category for. I found it through a medical archive survey I was conducting for an institutional inventory of Soviet-era sensory rehabilitation programs. Project Blind appeared in the registry as an anomalous entry, a medical rehabilitation program for visually impaired subjects, classified at a level substantially above what rehabilitation programs carry, with an access tier that required clearance I had to request specifically and separately from my standard medical archive permissions. The clearance came through. The file was waiting. Nothing personal. A classification level that did not fit its stated category, and classification levels that do not fit their stated categories are what archivists investigate. In those days, the Soviet state kept files on everything. Every program, every participant, every deviation from expected outcomes. Nothing was private. Today, you have a choice. NordVPN encrypts your internet traffic and keeps your identity hidden from anyone trying to track what you do online. If you want to protect your privacy, check the link in the pinned comment for an exclusive deal. The program was established in January 1966 under the dual authority of the Institute of Rehabilitative Medicine in Moscow and a scientific division whose affiliation the founding documents describe only by number. The medical framing was genuine. The program's first phase was standard sensory substitution research, the kind of work that legitimate rehabilitation science was pursuing across the same period in several countries. Teach blind subjects to navigate by sound, map the acoustic environment, develop echolocation as a functional substitute for vision. The science was sound. The funding was appropriate. The participants were clinically blind volunteers who had responded to a genuine rehabilitation recruitment notice. What the founding documents do not describe, but what the program director's personal file, at a higher classification level, makes clear, is that the rehabilitation framing was chosen deliberately as a container for a different question. The scientific division attached to the program had been investigating reports from various Soviet institutions across the preceding decade. Accounts from workers who had lost sensory function through injury or illness and who subsequently demonstrated perceptual capacities inconsistent with their documented deficits. Not extensive documentation, not systematic study, scattered incident reports from factory medical officers, hospital staff, military medical units, describing patients who seemed to perceive things their remaining senses should not have been able to detect. 11 separate incident reports across 10 years, each one individually explainable as observer error or patient suggestion, collectively suggesting something that required investigation. The rehabilitation program was the investigation. The echolocation training was the methodology. The genuine rehabilitation outcomes were real and were filed correctly in the medical literature. The other question, what happens to perception when a primary sensory channel is removed entirely, not reduced, but removed, was the question the scientific division had funded the program to answer. The first year confirmed the rehabilitation literature. The second year began to answer the other question. Fyodor Astapov was 41 years old when he entered the program in March 1966. He had been blind since a workplace accident in 1961, complete bilateral visual loss, confirmed by 3 independent neurological examinations, with no residual light perception. He was a factory supervisor by background, methodical and precise, described in his intake documentation as an ideal candidate for echolocation training because of his strong spatial reasoning and his capacity for systematic learning. He was the program's most diligent participant. He practiced his echolocation exercises outside scheduled sessions. He kept detailed personal notes on his progress. His notes became the most important document in this file about 14 months into the program. His journal entry from May 2, 1967 reads,
I want to document what happened during yesterday's session because I have been turning it over all night and I cannot find an explanation that fits inside what I thought was happening. We were doing the standard navigation exercise, room mapping, object location, the usual sequence. I was doing well, as I have been doing for several months, and I was almost finished with the formal exercise when I became aware of something I cannot describe accurately. Not a sound, not exactly. A kind of presence in the space. A quality of the room that I had not been attending to and suddenly was attending to. I tried to describe it to Dr. Ryabova afterward, and the best I could produce was the room felt more full than its sounds suggested. There was a small table in the far corner with several objects on it that were not part of the exercise. I had not been directed there. I had not heard anything from that corner. I described the table and the objects on it in some detail. Dr. Ryabova went to the corner. The table was there. The objects were there. I described them correctly. I am writing this down not because I think it is remarkable. I am not certain yet that it is, but because I am a methodical person, and methodical people write things down when they happen, especially when they do not understand them. I will try to reproduce the awareness in the next session and document whether it is repeatable.
He reproduced it. It was repeatable. His subsequent journal entries document a progressive expansion of what he called the awareness, a perceptual quality distinct from echolocation, not based on sound, not based on any sensory input he could identify, that allowed him to describe objects and spatial configurations he had no acoustic basis for knowing. By the summer of 1967, 16 months into the program, Astapov was routinely describing the contents of spaces he had never entered. By the autumn, he was describing the contents of spaces he could not physically access from his location. His journal from October 3, 1967, the period when his descriptions had extended beyond physically accessible spaces, is the entry that breaks the program's framing completely. Astapov continued documenting his experiences with the same methodical precision. He wrote,
I have been trying to understand the limits of the awareness, and I want to document what I have found because the documentation matters even if I cannot explain it. The awareness is not limited to the room I'm in. I established this last week. I will not describe how, because it would sound like I'm claiming something extraordinary, and I'm trying to describe it as ordinarily as possible. The awareness extends. I have not found where it stops extending. I have found objects in the adjacent room, in the room across the corridor, in the room below. I have found them without searching, not a deliberate scan, the way echolocation is deliberate. More like a background condition, the way peripheral vision is a background condition. You are not looking at the edge of your visual field, but it is there. I'm not attending to the room below, but something in me is. When I direct attention to it deliberately, the detail becomes clearer. This is consistent with how trained perception works. Training increases resolution, but the access was there before the training. I want to note one more thing. The awareness is not uniform. Some spaces are clearer than others. Some objects within a space are more present than others. I do not yet understand what determines this. I have begun to think the determining factor may not be spatial proximity. I do not know what it is instead. I am going to keep documenting and try not to theorize ahead of the evidence.
Try not to theorize ahead of the evidence. A methodical man, applying a methodical discipline to a process that was dissolving the ordinary categories of what a person can know. He kept not theorizing ahead of the evidence for 3 more years, while the evidence accumulated, while the program closed around him and transferred him somewhere the accessible archive does not describe. The program's medical director, Dr. Valentin Orlov, 52 years old, had been running the program with the specific confidence of a rehabilitation specialist, whose results were tracking closely with the published literature. Astapov's abilities fell outside the published literature. Orlov's response, documented in his working notes, was methodical. Test the abilities, rule out alternative explanations, determine whether the phenomenon was reproducible under controlled conditions. He ran 47 controlled trials across the autumn of 1967. The phenomenon was reproducible. The alternative explanations did not hold. By November, he had eliminated echolocation, residual light sensitivity, inadvertent cueing from research staff, and every other conventional mechanism he could test. He then did what careful scientists do when they have eliminated every explanation they can test. He called Moscow. The call is documented in the program's administrative log as a priority communication, duration 14 minutes. The content of the call is not in the administrative log. It is in a telephone intercept transcript filed in the program's classified subfolder, because Orlov's line was monitored as standard procedure for researchers at his classification level. The transcript reads,
Orlov, I am calling about one of our participants. I need to describe something to you, and I need you to tell me how to proceed, because I am outside my established protocol. The participant has developed an ability I cannot account for. He describes objects in adjacent rooms that he has no sensory access to. I have tested this 47 times under controlled conditions. He is correct in his descriptions in 43 of the 47 trials. The 4 failures appear to be failures of his own attention, rather than failures of the ability. On those 4 occasions, he described uncertainty beforehand. I have eliminated every conventional explanation I can construct. I cannot explain this in the framework of echolocation training.
There was a pause of approximately 4 seconds.
Moscow duty officer, what did you say the accuracy rate was? 43 of 47, above 90% under controlled conditions. And the other participants? 3 others show the ability at lower levels. 2 do not show it at all. Astapov is the most developed case. Close the program to external access. Continue. File reports through the restricted channel only. I want to be clear. I'm the medical director of a rehabilitation program. I don't have a protocol for what you're describing. You do now. Continue.
You do now. Continue. The 4-second pause between Orlov's description of 90% accuracy and the duty officer's response is the moment the program changed categories. From a rehabilitation initiative to something that warranted restricted reporting channels and closed external access. 4 seconds for someone in Moscow to decide that a blind man correctly describing the contents of locked rooms required that the work continue and the world not know about it. Orlov's personal working notes from the days following the call are in the file. They are not the measured language of his official reports. His entry from the day after the call reads,
I spent last night trying to decide what I have agreed to and whether I agreed to it or simply did not refuse it. The distinction matters to me. I called Moscow because I needed guidance on procedure for a finding outside my protocol. The guidance I received was close external access, continue, report through the restricted channel. These are instructions I can follow technically. What I am less certain about is whether following them is consistent with the medical commitments I made when I became the director of this program. I agreed to run a rehabilitation initiative. I am now running something that the restricted channel designation suggests is not primarily a rehabilitation initiative. The participants do not know this. They believe they are in a medical program. They signed consent forms for a medical program. I am going to continue because I have been told to and because the science is real and the participants are not being harmed. And I'm going to document my uncertainty here because documentation of uncertainty is the only professional integrity available to me in this circumstance.
The only professional integrity available to me. He ran the program for 3 more years, filing reports through the restricted channel, watching Astapov's abilities expand beyond anything his training had been designed to produce, and keeping his uncertainty in his personal notes where no one from Moscow would read it. Now I need to tell you what the program understood about what was happening inside Astapov's brain. I thought Project Blind was a program that had discovered an edge case in human sensory substitution, an unusually capable participant who had developed echolocation to an unusual degree, perhaps in combination with other subtle sensory cues the controlled trials had not successfully eliminated. Extraordinary echolocation exists. Blind practitioners with exceptional ability have been documented in the scientific literature. I assumed the program had found one and classified the finding for political reasons rather than scientific ones. I was wrong about what the program had found. The finding was not extraordinary echolocation. Echolocation was the training framework. What Astapov had developed through echolocation training was something the training was not designed to produce. Something the training had apparently removed a barrier to. The neurophysiologist who assessed Astapov was Dr. Irina Kravtsova, 47 years old, from the Institute of Brain Research in Leningrad. She was brought in during the program's 3rd year, after the restricted channel was established, to provide a neurological assessment of Astapov's abilities. Her report runs to 61 pages. The central section is the most important 61 pages in this file.
I want to propose a framework for understanding what Astapov's abilities represent, not because the framework is complete, It is not, but because without any framework, the program's documentation will remain a collection of anomalous findings with no coherent interpretation. The framework is as follows. The human visual system is not primarily a recording device. It is primarily a filtering device. Its evolutionary function is not to perceive everything in the environment, but to perceive the things that matter for survival and suppress everything else. This suppression is active and metabolically expensive. A significant portion of the brain's processing capacity is devoted not to seeing, but to deciding what not to see. What I believe Astapov's training has produced is the following. By removing the visual system's input entirely, not merely reducing it, removing it, the echolocation training has gradually reallocated the resources devoted to visual suppression. The brain stops filtering the visual channel because there is nothing to filter. And in stopping that filtering, it has become available for other processing that the filtering had been suppressing. Astapov is not seeing with his ears. He is perceiving information that was always available in the environment, and that his visual system, when it was functional, was spending considerable resources to prevent him from consciously accessing. The visual system suppressed it. The echolocation training removed the visual system from the equation. What remained is what had always been there, beneath the suppression, waiting.
What had always been there, beneath the suppression, waiting. A neurophysiologist describing the human visual system as a barrier that, once removed, reveals a perceptual capacity that had been there all along. Not a new ability, an uncovered one. Kravtsova's report addresses the other 5 participants as well. The variation in outcomes across the group is, in her analysis, the most important data in the program. More important than Astapov's individual case, because it reveals the conditions under which the uncovering occurs. Her findings. 2 participants showed no evidence of the expanded awareness at any point in the program. Their echolocation training was successful. They navigated effectively. They did not describe objects outside their acoustic range. Kravtsova's analysis. The visual suppression mechanism in these 2 participants had not been fully deactivated by the removal of visual input. She speculates that the suppression in these cases was more deeply embedded, possibly habituated differently, possibly connected to other cognitive systems in ways that made it resistant to the echolocation training's reallocation effect. 3 participants showed the ability at lower developmental levels than Astapov, present, intermittent, not fully consistent. They described adjacent room objects correctly at rates between 60 and 70%, compared to Astapov's 90+. Kravtsova's analysis. The reallocation was partial. The suppression mechanism had been partially deactivated. What was beneath it was accessible, but not reliably so. Astapov. Full reallocation, consistent access, expanding range. Ability that appeared to be developing rather than stabilizing. Kravtsova's note on his specific case is the most careful sentence in her 61 pages.
I cannot determine whether the expansion of Astapov's perceptual range has a ceiling, or whether the ceiling, if it exists, has any relationship to spatial distance as we ordinarily understand it.
Whether the ceiling has any relationship to spatial distance as we ordinarily understand it. 6 years after the program ended, he was drawing floor plans of buildings in a city where he had never lived. The program's medical records for all 6 participants show complete bilateral visual loss, confirmed and reconfirmed across multiple neurological examinations throughout the program's duration. No residual light perception, no functional photoreception, no visual pathway activity detectable by the available instruments. The participants were clinically completely blind. The program's experimental protocols, the assessments designed to test echolocation progress, begin to contain, from the program's second year onward, descriptions of visual qualities. Participants describing the color of objects, the texture of surfaces, the specific typography of printed text on a card placed in the assessment space without acoustic properties sufficient to distinguish it from a blank card. A blind subject describing the color of a card he cannot see in a room mapped by sound accurately 43 times in 47 trials. The medical record says, complete visual loss, no exceptions. The experimental record says, visual qualities accurately described by persons with complete visual loss. The same participants, the same program, two sets of documentation producing incompatible accounts of what the participants can perceive. One of these records is wrong, or neither record is wrong, and the category that makes them contradictory, the assumption that visual qualities can only be perceived through the visual system, is what needs revision. Here's the second contradiction. The program maintained parallel documentation for Astapov specifically, because his case was the most developed and warranted the most detailed record. The medical file documents a participant in excellent cognitive and physical health, making strong progress in echolocation training, demonstrating no psychological anomalies or cognitive deficits. Standard medical language describing a successful rehabilitation participant. The psychological file, maintained by a separate clinician, Dr. Savelyeva, whose notes are filed in the restricted subfolder, describes a participant undergoing a fundamental and progressive restructuring of his perceptual relationship with the world. Her notes from the program's final year describe Astapov as
increasingly unable to distinguish between what he perceives through trained echolocation and what he perceives through the other channel. The distinction between the two is dissolving. He experiences both as equally valid sources of information about the world. He is not concerned by this. He considers it a clarification rather than a confusion. I'm not certain he is wrong about this. I'm uncertain whether his current perceptual state is a pathology or an achievement.
Two accounts of the same person, medically stable and progressing well, or undergoing a perceptual transformation whose classification as pathology or achievement the clinician cannot determine. The medical file and the psychological file describe the same Astapov in the same year and produce incompatible assessments of what is happening to him. Here is the third contradiction, the document that should not exist. The program's medical phase was formally concluded by an administrative order dated March 14, 1970. The order certifies completion of the rehabilitation research objectives and authorizes the discharge of participants to follow-up care. Standard medical program closure language. The follow-up care records that should document the participant's transition to ordinary medical oversight do not exist. The 6 participants were not discharged to standard follow-up care. The March 14th order is the last document in the standard program file for each of them. After that date, they simply disappear from the accessible medical archive. They were not discharged. They were transferred. The transfer documentation, where they went, under what authority, for what purpose, is referenced by a file number that leads to a classification level I cannot access. A program about teaching blind people to navigate by sound, terminating its medical phase and transferring its participants into a program that has no accessible documentation. The medical phase ended. Something else continued. What it was is in a vault I cannot open. The medical archive entry that led me to this file, The anomalous classification flag that prompted my request for clearance is a hospital admission record. Astapov, Fyodor Mikhailovich, admitted to a psychiatric facility in Leningrad in March 1974, 3 years after the program's official conclusion. Diagnosis: severe perceptual dysfunction, acute presentation. The symptom description in the admission record: patient reports visual perception despite confirmed clinical blindness. Patient accurately describes objects in adjacent rooms and in rooms he has not entered. Patient's descriptions have been verified by ward staff on multiple occasions. Patient does not regard his perceptions as anomalous. Patient regards them as normal function. Ward staff verified the descriptions. He was describing objects in rooms he had not entered, and the descriptions were correct, and the psychiatric facility responded by classifying his accurate perceptions as symptoms of a disorder requiring treatment. He was admitted in 1974. He was discharged in 1977 after 3 years. The discharge record notes: condition unresolved, patient released at own request. A psychiatric facility that had been attempting for 3 years to treat accurate perception as a pathology, releasing a patient whose accurate perception had not been successfully treated because accurate perception does not respond to treatment for pathology. The final document in the Astapov case file, not the medical record, a document filed separately in an envelope attached to the back of the folder, is a handwritten note. The note was written on the day before Astapov's discharge. He gave it to a nurse and asked her to attach it to his file. It reads,
To whoever reads this file in the future, I'm not sick. What they taught us to do in the program, I can still do. I can see without eyes. Not the way I saw before I lost my sight. A different way. Through sound, through space, through something I cannot name. The doctors here think it is impossible. They think I'm confused or lying, but I'm not. I see the corridor outside my room. I see the nurse's station at the end of the hall. I see the courtyard beyond the window I have never approached. I see these things as clearly as you see this page. They tried to teach us to navigate. They taught us something else, something they did not intend. And now they want to pretend it did not happen. But it did. And I'm not sick.
The final note in Astapov's file is dated June 1977, 6 months before his death. It begins with a statement of purpose.
I am writing this for whoever reads this file after I am gone, because someone will read it, and I want that person to have something that the medical record will not give them. The medical record will say I had a disorder of perception. The medical record is wrong about what was disordered. I am not losing my mind. I am seeing too well. The difference is that I have finally understood that before the accident, before the program, before everything, I was seeing too little. The visual system is a narrow window. I had one, and I lost it. And in losing it, I found that there was never just the window. There was everything outside it. The window is comfortable. It is oriented and bounded, and it tells you where you are and what is in front of you, and it does not trouble you with what is in the room, down the corridor, or the building across the city, or the place you have not visited and will not visit. I am troubled by all of those things now. I cannot explain whether being troubled by them is a loss or a gain. I believe it is a gain. The doctors believe it is a loss. We are both correct about what has changed. We disagree about the direction. I am going home. I am going to try to live the rest of my life in the fullness of what I can perceive. I do not know how to do this. I will try to be methodical about it.
He was trying to be methodical about it 6 months before he died. The diagram on the back of the note is drawn in the same careful hand as the note itself. Measured, proportionate, the spatial reasoning of a factory supervisor who became a person whose spatial awareness had outgrown the building he was in. I have been looking at this diagram for 2 weeks. It is precise, the proportions are consistent, the layout coherent, the draftsmanship careful for a man who had been blind for 16 years. The kind of diagram a methodical man produces when he is trying to communicate something exactly, when he wants to be certain that what he has perceived is transmissible to someone who has not perceived it. I work in an archive building. I have worked here for 11 years. I know this building's floor plan the way you know a place you have spent a decade in, not by memorizing a diagram, but by accumulating the specific knowledge of corridors and rooms that daily presence produces. The diagram is the floor plan of this building. I measured the proportions. I counted the doors. I traced the corridor that runs from the main entrance to the reading rooms at the rear. I identified the room marked with the cross by locating its position in the layout relative to the entrance, the main stairwell, and the 2 adjacent rooms whose functions I know. Room with the cross, the reading room where I am sitting. Astapov died in Leningrad in December 1977, 6 months after his discharge, of causes the death record describes as cardiac, unrelated to his perceptual condition. He never worked here. There is no record connecting him to this institution, this city, or this building. He was 62 years old when he died, blind since 1961, participant in a classified program whose second phase is inaccessible to me, psychiatric patient for 3 years, discharged at his own request 6 months before his death. There is no mechanism by which he should have known this building's floor plan. There is a mechanism, Kravtsova's mechanism, the perceptual access beneath the visual suppression, the awareness whose ceiling she could not locate and whose relationship to spatial distance she explicitly declined to assume. That would explain it, if the mechanism extends the way her analysis implies it might. Across distance, across time, to buildings not yet visited by the person whose perception extends toward them. End of Part 8. I am a methodical person. I do not draw conclusions I cannot support with evidence. The evidence I can support is this. A blind man, 3 years in a psychiatric facility for accurately perceiving things he should not have been able to perceive, drew a precise diagram of a building he had no documented connection to on the day before his discharge, and the building is this one, and the room with the cross is where I am reading his file. The evidence I cannot explain. Why this building? Why this room? Whether the cross means I will find the file, or whether it means something about me that Kravtsova's framework would require me to accept as a finding rather than a coincidence. I am going to close this file. I am going to note the anomalous classification in the medical registry as reviewed and reconciled. I am going to file my access request log and return the file to the archive. I am going to do all of this without looking up from the documents, because I have been in this room for 4 hours, and the room feels at this particular moment more full than its sound suggests. Astapov's phrase, not mine. His, from May 1967, the first time he noticed. I am going to close the file. I am going to close the file. I am going to close the file.